The people of Jeju village had always lived peacefully, surrounded by lush fields and a flowing river. But one day, the skies turned grey, and the rain stopped falling. The crops began to wither, and the livestock grew weak. The villagers whispered that the gods were angry. They spoke of a great sin committed long ago, a secret buried deep in the village's past. As the days turned into weeks, the famine grew worse. The river, once full of life, began to dry up. The villagers prayed, but no answer came. The once thriving village was now on the brink of collapse. The king, a wise and just ruler, called his advisors to find a solution. They searched through ancient scrolls and consulted the elders, but no one could explain the cause of the famine. The people grew desperate, and many began to leave the village in search of better lands. The king knew he had to act quickly. He decided to seek the wisdom of the oracle, a mysterious figure who lived deep in the forest. With a heavy heart, the king set out on a journey to find the oracle, hoping for a solution to save his people. The king traveled for days through the barren land, his heart heavy with worry. Finally, he reached the oracle's hut, hidden deep in the forest. The oracle, an old woman with piercing eyes, listened to the king's plea. She closed her eyes and chanted in a language the king did not understand. After a long silence, she spoke. "The famine is a punishment," she said. "The ancient river is angry. To appease it, you must make a great sacrifice." The king's heart sank. "What sacrifice?" he asked. The oracle's voice was cold and firm. "You must offer your only son, Crown Prince Akanji, to the river. Only then will the rains return." The king was horrified. He could not imagine sacrificing his beloved son. He returned to the village, torn between his duty to his people and his love for his child. The chiefs and elders gathered to hear the oracle's words. They pleaded with the king to accept the sacrifice, but he refused. The village was in chaos, and the king felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Crown Prince Akanji was a brave and selfless young man. He had seen the suffering of his people and could not bear to watch them starve. When he learned of the oracle's prophecy, he made a decision. He went to his father and said, "I will do it. I will be the sacrifice." The king was heartbroken. He tried to convince Akanji to change his mind, but the prince was determined. "If my life can save the village, then I am willing," Akanji said. The chiefs and elders praised Akanji's courage, but the king could not hide his grief. He spent the night in prayer, hoping for another solution. But as the sun rose, he knew there was no other way. The king finally agreed to the sacrifice, but his heart was heavy with sorrow. The villagers prepared for the ritual, their faces filled with both hope and sadness. Akanji stood tall, ready to face his fate. On the day of the ritual, the entire village gathered by the ancient river. The traditionalists, dressed in ceremonial robes, led Akanji to the riverbank. The prince wore a simple white robe, symbolizing purity. The villagers chanted prayers, their voices echoing across the dry land. The traditionalists began the ritual, calling upon the spirits of the river. As the chants grew louder, the water began to ripple. The villagers held their breath, watching in awe. Suddenly, a beautiful mermaid emerged from the river. Her long hair shimmered like gold, and her eyes sparkled with an otherworldly light. She looked at Akanji and smiled. The traditionalists were stunned. They had expected the river to claim the prince, but instead, the mermaid spoke. "I have come not to take his life, but to offer a solution," she said. The mermaid's voice was soft but commanding. "I have fallen in love with Crown Prince Akanji," she declared. "If you allow us to marry, I will bring rain back to Jeju village." The villagers gasped in surprise. The traditionalists exchanged uncertain glances. They had never heard of such a proposal. The mermaid continued, "This is the only way to appease the river. My love for Akanji will bring life back to your land." The traditionalists hurried to deliver the mermaid's message to the king. He was shocked and confused. Marrying his son to a mermaid was unheard of. He called for a meeting with the chiefs and elders to discuss the proposal. Some argued that it was a sign from the gods, while others feared the consequences of such a union. The king was torn. He looked at Akanji, who stood silently, his face unreadable. The fate of the village hung in the balance. The king paced back and forth in his chamber, his mind racing. He could not bear the thought of losing his son, but he also could not ignore the suffering of his people. The chiefs and elders urged him to accept the mermaid's proposal. It is the only way to save the village, they said. The king sighed deeply. He called Akanji to his side and asked, "What do you think, my son?" Akanji looked into his father's eyes and said, "I am willing to do whatever it takes to save our people. If marrying the mermaid will bring rain, then I will do it." The king's heart ached, but he knew his son was right. With a heavy heart, he agreed to the mermaid's proposal. The villagers rejoiced, but the king could not shake the feeling of unease. He prayed that this decision would not bring more sorrow to his family. The village buzzed with excitement as preparations for the wedding began. The traditionalists worked tirelessly to create a ceremony that would honor both the human and spirit worlds. The mermaid provided pearls and seashells to decorate the altar, while the villagers offered flowers and fruits. Akanji was dressed in royal robes, his face calm but thoughtful. As the day of the wedding approached, the king noticed a change in the air. The sky, once clear and dry, now held a hint of moisture. The villagers whispered that the mermaid's presence was already bringing blessings. On the eve of the wedding, the king sat with Akanji and said, "You are brave, my son. I hope this union will bring peace to our land." Akanji nodded, but deep down, he wondered what life with a mermaid would be like. The wedding day arrived, and the entire village gathered by the river. The mermaid emerged from the water, her beauty even more radiant than before. She wore a gown made of shimmering scales, and her eyes sparkled with joy. Akanji stood by her side, his heart pounding. The traditionalists began the ceremony, blending human and spirit rituals. As the vows were exchanged, the sky darkened, and a gentle rain began to fall. The villagers cheered, their faces wet with tears of joy. The king watched in awe, his heart filled with both happiness and sorrow. The mermaid took Akanji's hand and said, "Together, we will bring life back to this land." Akanji smiled, feeling a strange sense of peace. The wedding marked the beginning of a new chapter for Jeju village, but no one knew what the future would hold. After the wedding, the rains continued to fall, and the land began to heal. The crops grew tall, and the river flowed once more. The villagers celebrated, but the king could not shake his worries. He watched as Akanji and the mermaid spent their days by the river, their bond growing stronger. The mermaid taught Akanji about the secrets of the water, while Akanji shared stories of the human world. Despite the happiness around him, the king felt a growing sense of unease. He wondered if the mermaid's love for Akanji was genuine or if she had another motive. The chiefs assured him that the union was a blessing, but the king could not ignore the whispers of doubt in his heart. He decided to keep a close eye on the mermaid, hoping to protect his son from any harm. One night, the king followed the mermaid to the river. He hid behind a tree and watched as she sang a haunting melody. The water glowed with a strange light, and the king felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that the mermaid was not just a creature of beauty but also of great power. The next day, the king confronted Akanji and said, "Be careful, my son. The mermaid is not what she seems." Akanji frowned. "Father, she has brought life back to our village. Why do you doubt her?" The king sighed. "I cannot explain it, but I feel there is more to her than we know." Akanji nodded, but he trusted the mermaid. He believed that their love was strong enough to overcome any challenge. As the days passed, the rains grew heavier. What was once a gentle drizzle turned into a fierce storm. The river overflowed, and the fields were flooded. The villagers began to worry. They had prayed for rain, but now they feared it would destroy their homes. The chiefs went to the king and said, "We must ask the mermaid to calm the storm." The king agreed and went to the river with Akanji. The mermaid listened to their plea and said, "The storm is a sign of the river's power. It cannot be controlled." Akanji looked at her with concern. "Is there nothing we can do?" he asked. The mermaid hesitated, then said, There is a way, but it will require a great sacrifice. The king's heart sank. He feared that the mermaid's love for Akanji was not enough to save the village. The mermaid revealed that the storm was a test from the ancient river. To calm it, the village would need to offer another sacrifice. This time, it would not be a life but a treasure. The mermaid explained that the river demanded a precious artifact, a symbol of the village's devotion. The king and the chief searched through the village's history and found an ancient amulet, said to hold great power. The king was reluctant to part with the amulet, but he knew it was the only way to save the village. He handed it to the mermaid, who took it to the river. As she placed the amulet in the water, the storm began to subside. The villagers cheered, but the king felt a growing sense of unease. He wondered how many more sacrifices the river would demand. Akanji began to feel torn between his love for the mermaid and his duty to his people. He saw how the village was struggling to recover from the storm, and he wondered if the mermaid's presence was truly a blessing. One night, he asked her, "Is there no other way to bring peace to the village?" The mermaid looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "The river is ancient and powerful," she said. "It demands respect and sacrifice. I am doing my best to protect your people, but there are limits to what I can do." Akanji nodded, but he could not shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He decided to seek answers on his own, hoping to find a way to break the cycle of sacrifice. Akanji spent days searching through the village's ancient records. He found a hidden scroll that spoke of the river's history. The scroll revealed that the river was once a peaceful spirit, but it had been angered by the greed of the villagers long ago. The only way to truly appease it was to restore balance to the land. Akanji realized that the sacrifices were only temporary solutions. He went to the mermaid and shared his discovery. She listened carefully, then said, "You are wise, Akanji. The river's anger runs deep, but perhaps there is a way to heal it." Together, they began to plan a new approach, one that would not require further sacrifices. Akanji and the mermaid proposed a new plan to the king and the chiefs. They suggested planting trees along the riverbank and creating a sanctuary for the river spirits. The king was skeptical but agreed to give it a try. The villagers worked together, planting trees and building small shrines to honor the river. As the days passed, the land began to change. The river's waters grew clearer, and the storms became less frequent. The mermaid smiled, seeing the progress. "The river is beginning to heal," she said. Akanji felt a sense of hope. He believed that they were finally on the right path. Just as the village began to recover, the river tested them once more. A sudden drought struck, and the crops began to wither. The villagers panicked, fearing that their efforts had been in vain. The mermaid explained that the river was testing their commitment. "We must show that we are willing to protect it, even in difficult times," she said. Akanji and the villagers worked tirelessly to care for the trees and shrines. They prayed and made offerings, showing their respect for the river. Slowly, the rains returned, and the land began to heal once more. The king saw the strength of his people and felt a renewed sense of hope. As the village prospered, the mermaid began to grow weaker. Akanji noticed that her once radiant glow was fading. He asked her what was wrong, and she replied, "My power comes from the river. As it heals, I must return to its depths." Akanji was heartbroken. He had grown to love the mermaid deeply and could not bear the thought of losing her. The mermaid smiled and said, "Do not be sad, Akanji. Our love has brought life back to this land. That is a gift greater than any sacrifice." She kissed him gently, then disappeared into the river. Akanji stood by the water, his heart heavy but filled with gratitude. With the mermaid gone, Akanji took on the role of protecting the river. He taught the villagers to respect the land and to live in harmony with nature. The king saw the wisdom in his son's actions and supported him fully. The village flourished, and the people lived in peace. Akanji often visited the river, remembering the mermaid and the love they had shared. He knew that her sacrifice had saved the village, and he vowed to honor her memory by continuing to protect the land. The story of the mermaid and the prince became a legend, passed down through generations as a reminder of the power of love and sacrifice. The villagers of Jeju held a grand festival to celebrate the return of peace and prosperity. They honored Akanji for his bravery and wisdom, and they paid tribute to the mermaid whose love had saved them. The festival was filled with music, dance, and offerings to the river. Akanji stood before the people, humbled by their gratitude. As the celebrations continued, Akanji felt a deep sense of responsibility. He knew that the village's newfound peace was fragile and that they must remain vigilant. He vowed to continue the work he had started, ensuring that the river and the land were always respected. The festival marked the beginning of a new era for Jeju, one built on unity and reverence for nature. The king watched the festival with pride but also with a heavy heart. He thought of the sacrifices that had been made and the lessons they had learned. He called Akanji to his side and said, "You have grown into a wise and compassionate leader. I am proud of you, my son." Akanji smiled and replied, "I could not have done it without your guidance, father." The king nodded, but he knew that the time had come for him to step aside. He announced that Akanji would take on more responsibilities as the future ruler of Jeju. The villagers cheered, knowing that their village was in good hands. As Akanji took on his new role, he faced many challenges. The villagers looked to him for guidance, and he worked tirelessly to ensure their needs were met. He continued to promote harmony with the river, teaching the people to care for the land and to avoid greed. One day, a group of villagers came to him with a problem. They had discovered a new source of water, but it was located in a sacred part of the forest. Akanji knew that they needed the water, but he also understood the importance of respecting the spirits. He decided to consult the traditionalists and seek a solution that would honor both the people and the land. Akanji and the traditionalists ventured into the sacred forest, where they performed rituals to ask for permission to use the water. They left offerings and prayed for guidance. After 3 days, they received a sign. A bird appeared, leading them to a different water source that was not in the sacred area. The villagers were amazed by Akanji's wisdom and patience. They saw that he was not only a strong leader but also a man of deep respect for the spirits. The new water source brought relief to the village, and Akanji's reputation grew even stronger. One day, a stranger arrived in Jeju village. He was a traveler from a distant land, seeking shelter and food. The villagers were wary, but Akanji welcomed the man with open arms. He believed that kindness and hospitality were important values. The stranger stayed in the village for several days, sharing stories of his travels. He spoke of lands where people had forgotten the importance of nature and were suffering as a result. Akanji listened carefully, realizing that Jeju's lessons could help others. He decided to document the village's journey, hoping to share their story with the world. Akanji began writing the village chronicles, a detailed account of Jeju's struggles and triumphs. He included the story of the mermaid, the sacrifices made, and the lessons learned. The villagers helped him gather information, and the traditionalists shared their knowledge of the spirits. The chronicles became a treasured document, passed down through generations. Akanji hoped that it would serve as a guide for future leaders and a reminder of the importance of living in harmony with nature. The villagers were proud of their history and grateful for Akanji's efforts to preserve it. Just as the village seemed to be thriving, a new challenge arose. The rain stopped, and the river's water levels began to drop. The villagers grew anxious, fearing that the famine would return. Akanji called a meeting to discuss the situation. The traditionalists suggested that the river might be testing them again. Akanji agreed and proposed a plan to show their commitment. He organized a day of prayer and offerings, where the entire village came together to honor the river. They planted more trees and cleaned the riverbanks, showing their respect for the land. After weeks of effort, the river began to respond. The water levels rose, and the rains returned. The villagers rejoiced, knowing that their actions had made a difference.
For more interesting and captivating stories, Opera Media is just a click away. Thank you for watching.